Hello and welcome to this introduction to my new book, The Woman's Realm, Stories of Inverclyde Women through Cartsburn Publishing. Over the years I have tended to concentrate my writing on the manly subjects of war, industry, football, etc. The one thing I always maintain is that I can bring Greenock and Inverclyde into any conversation on historical subjects. My interest in history is on the social side, the people. It is a person and their individual life experience that makes it unique, and Inverclyde has had so many unique individuals with a story to tell. Of course, this has nearly always been about the men, but lurking in the background are the women, of course. It is time to highlight them and their lived experience in this unique location. I use the term unique to differentiate us from my arch-enemy and nemesis, the city of Glasgow. To tell these stories, I have had the assistance of some rather wonderful women who have graciously volunteered their expertise. I would like to thank Liz Smith for her contributions, available on our wonderful Greenockian blog, Margaret Kane of the Burns Club for her research into Burns Club ladies, Isabel McCulley and Lillian Newman of what was the East End Advisory, the ladies of IHN for their support, and especially Lorraine Murray for her contributions and editorial skills. I also dedicate the book to my family and especially to the memory of my mother and my sister. I have researched over 150 women in 11 different categories. The categories being the ladies of Inverclyde, benefactors, the ladies of empire, religion, wives and daughters, political awakening, war and health, victims, education, the arts, and enterprising women. Today I shall talk briefly about each of the categories and some of the women you will meet in the book. But first I thought I would role-play a mid-19th century gentleman and give some advice to young ladies. Taken from the Greenock Advertiser of 1847, and it gives just an idea of what women have been up against over the years. What a pity it is that the 1000th chance of a gentleman's becoming your lover should deprive you of the pleasure of a free, unembarrassed intellectual intercourse with all the single men of your acquaintance. Yet such is too commonly the case with young ladies who have read a great many novels and whose heads are always running on love and lovers. Someone has said that matrimony is with women the great business of life, whereas with men it is only an incident, an important one to be sure, but only one among many to which their attention is directed, and often kept entirely out of view during several years of their early life. Now, this difference gives the other sex a great advantage over you, and the best way to equalise your lot and become as wise as they are is to think as little about it as they do. The less your mind dwells upon lovers and matrimony, the more agreeable and profitable will be your intercourse with gentlemen. If you regard men as intellectual beings who have access to certain sources of knowledge of which you are deprived, and seek to derive all the benefit you can from their peculiar attainments and experience, if you talk to them as one rational being should with another, and never remind them that you are candidates for matrimony, you will enjoy far more than you can by regarding them under that one aspect of possible admirers and lovers. When that is the ruling and absorbing thought, you have not the proper use of your faculties. Your manners are constrained and awkward, you are easily embarrassed, and made to say what is ill-judged, silly, and out of place. And you defeat your own views by appearing to a great disadvantage. However secret you may be in these speculations, if you are continually thinking of them and attaching unimportance to the acquaintance, it will most certainly show itself in your manners and conversation, and will betray a weakness that is held in especial contempt by the stronger sex. An alternative is that your father can offer suitable financial bribes to prospective suitors. For example, the 5 daughters of George Robertson, of the Tontine Hotel mansion fame, were each given £2,000, or approximately £250,000 in today's money, tocher, or dowry. Strangely enough, they managed to attract suitably influential husbands. In 1816, Barbara married Neil Douglas, who had fought at Waterloo and later became the governor of Edinburgh Castle. She became Lady Douglas after he was knighted. They stayed in Inverclyde House in Perth, and Neil was one of the Douglas brothers who owned estates in St Vincent. These were inherited by his sister Cecilia, who owned the Douglas Park estate, or Orbiston. Rosina married James Tasker, a business partner of her father. Susan married James Hunter, another business partner of Hunter's Quay fame in Dunoon. Janet married Arthur Ochterson, a West Indies merchant, and Lilius married James Ochterson. So daughters of merchants did indeed tend to be married to men who would help the family business through their connections. This is a marble bust of Jane Tucker Ewing. In 1836, James Ewing, 61 years old, married Jane Tucker Crawford, the 23-year-old daughter of James Crawford, who had been connected with Crawford, Tucker & Co. of Port Glasgow, one of the largest businesses on the Clyde. She had lived at Broadstone in Port Glasgow. Crawford was made bankrupt after the 3 privateer ships he had fitted out against the French and Americans had all been captured. The couple had no children. In 1838, the Glasgow house was sold by James Ewing for £35,000 to the Edinburgh and Glasgow Railway Company, who built Queen Street Station on the ground after demolishing the house. In 1844, James and Jane, together with her lady's maid, set off on a 13-month tour of the continent. These letters were very numerous and gave an extremely full and interesting account of their journey and observations of people, manufacturing, agriculture and local history. Strangely enough though, Jane is only ever referred to as Mrs. Ewing in these letters. James died in his George Street, Glasgow townhouse on 29th of November in his 79th year in 1853. His nephew Humphrey Ewing Crum changed his name to Humphrey Ewing Crum Ewing when he inherited the business of James Ewing and Co., the estates in Jamaica and St Kitts, and the house and estates of Strathleven. Jane was given life rent of Strathleven House and outlived Humphrey Crum Ewing, who rented Arden Capel House in Hillsborough. Over the course of this talk, you'll notice a pattern developing: the idea of young women marrying men 20 to 30 years older. Some women were born into status and wealth, and I look at the ladies of the Shaw Stewarts, the Crawfords of Cartsburn, the wives of Lord Inverclyde at Women's Bay, and the wives of the Lords of Newark in Port Glasgow or Newark. Margaret Crawford married Patrick Maxwell at the end of the 16th century and lived at Newark Castle in Port Glasgow, and had possibly 16 children together. Her name is prominent due to the abuse she suffered at the hands of her husband throughout her life. After 44 years, he began physically and mentally abusing her. She appealed to the Scottish Parliament, but ended up escaping to Dumbarton, where she lived in poverty. Now this does bring up a common link throughout history of the experience of women at the hands of their husband. I talk in the book about Mrs. Kerr. We don't know her first name, murdered by her husband in Greenock in 1827 for being drunk. And then, much later, the mental abuse and jealous rages by Lord Inverclyde, Alan Burns, of his second wife, June Howard Tripp. These facts only ever come to light when the law is involved. June Howard Tripp, pictured here, suffered at the hands of Alan Burns verbal abuse, bullying and harassment. Though she does retell a funny story of a visit to the Cowell Games. At each one of our stops, I had been offered a wee cup of tea, but no one asked me if I would like to powder my nose. And what with the tea, the rain and the cold, by the time I reached the grandstand in the recreation field, Nature was threatening to catch up with me. Having accepted a bouquet and received a half-dozen officials, I was in agony. I whispered to Alan, "How long before this is over?" "About an hour, I'd say." "Well," I said, "where is it?" He turned to me and gave me one of his bland looks. "Where is what?" "You know perfectly well what," I hissed. "Oh," he said, "God knows if there is one." I left him in the seat and went along the grandstand under hundreds of staring eyes. At the foot of the steps, I whispered to a bystander who pointed to a wooden building away across the sodden field. As I stumbled through the wet clay, I heard the 1,000 pipers beginning to blow their pipes. More than once I lost a shoe in the mud, retrieved it and struggled on. But when I got there, the place was jammed to the entrance with anxious-looking Scottish housewives. Desperate, I looked about for any object of shelter, but there was none, and I was on the verge of tears when a rosy-faced little old lady said, "Och, my lady, are ye in an awful hurry?" "Oh yes," I cried. "Well," she twinkled, "if you'll step outside and round the back, I'll protect you with my wee umbrella." June Howard Tripp divorced Alan Burns after 2 or 3 years' marriage, and he proceeded to harass her through lawyers and detectives. Probably a common story of harassment. This chapter is mainly about those local women whose names and life stories have become publicly known purely because of what, in the vast majority, men have done to them. This chapter is an attempt to try and recognise them as individuals. A brief look at witch hunting in Inverclyde with the help of my friend and colleague Lorraine Murray, one of the leading authorities on the subject. The most dramatic representation of how women were treated in a male-dominated society is highlighted by the accusations of witchcraft in Inverclyde in the 17th century. The name of one woman, Mary Lamont, has come to represent everything that modern women have done to fight for their rights to be whoever and whatever they want to be, and not be subject to the age-old prejudices and fears about female power which led to the death of Mary. There were several female murder victims in Inverclyde, and I shall briefly outline a few of their cases. But if we look at the crime figures in the 19th century, women got into trouble mainly for theft and drunkenness. But are they actually victims too? Returning to my initial thesis of how women's names get recorded for posterity, newspaper reports would often, of course, name and shame these women without giving any extenuating circumstances. We now know some of the issues facing women which may cause them to turn to criminality: poverty, drugs and alcohol, domestic abuse and mental illness. These issues are the same now as it was in the 19th century. Inverclyde has some of the worst living conditions, the highest levels of poverty, the lowest life expectancy, and easy access to alcohol. As I mentioned, we don't get to hear stories of women because they're never mentioned. They're always referred to as Mr. or Mrs. John Smith, I should say, or whatever. Stories of named women are rare, and if they are, it's because of court cases or because of their status in life. This, fortunately, has changed, but it makes it difficult to find stories of women. Do you know the name Elizabeth Harmiston? She is better known as Lizzie Pastore. She was murdered by her stalker outside the Havelock buildings on Argyle Street. Lizzie Pastore was actually her stage name, as she performed at Cook Circus on Campbell Street. Unfortunately, she is never referred to by her real name in any of the press coverage. Here are a couple of random postings in the local newspapers that give some ideas of attitudes to women in the 19th century. This is from 1846. On Saturday, about 12 o'clock, one of those miserable females who infest our streets was found dead upon the shore near the powder houses. No marks of violence were discovered, and therefore the presumption is that she died of cold, hunger and disease combined. Her name was Mary Duncan, but from her cheerful temper, good appearance and propensity to and skill in singing, she was more generally known by the appellation of the Canary. The body was deposited in the vault or porch of the West Church till it should be claimed or be got interred. Here's another article from 1870s. The headline reads, "Female dressed in man's clothes." Considerable amusement was caused among the people in Dalrymple Street yesterday by the appearance there of a young woman named Nellie McCann, a native of Coatbridge, dressed in a sailor suit. It appears that a bluejacket belonging to the Ajax had gone to sleep in a house in the vicinity, and, all unknown to him, the woman attired herself in his clothes and went out for a walk. The police intervened, however, and had her conveyed to the office, and at today's police court, where she was charged with conducting herself in an indecent manner by appearing on the street dressed in male attire. She pleaded guilty, and Baillie Lang fined her 10 shillings with the option of going to prison for 5 days. We now come to talk about the arts. We have a large list of ladies who were involved in the arts, but references to them are relatively few and far between, and perhaps some of the connections I have are slightly tangential, with a couple of Burns amours, Mary Campbell and Jean Finlay, being included. Our earliest poet would be Jean Adam of Cartsburn, famous for "There's Nae Luck About the House." This was followed in the 19th century by Margaret Peace and Mary Macpherson, the latter drawing on the Gaelic community. Liz Smith recalls Lives of Finlay and Peace, originally published on the excellent Greenokian blog. Lorraine Murray tells us about Mrs. Black, the Watt librarian, and I have also included Jane Patterson Mill, a Guruk school teacher who wrote adventures for teenage school children. Becoming an artist tended to be the reserve of the better class of young lady, though usually as amateurs. We have a list of these amateur enthusiasts who appear to be in many cases related. They were part of the West End elite, whose wives and daughters sought to express themselves in an era where educational opportunities were limited, although improving, and political changes were being demanded. The personal stories of some bring out aspects that aren't art-related necessarily, but are of human interest and show the family cliques of Greenock. I have also highlighted the story of the actress Lizzie Wilmore, to give reference to the very active theatre scene in Greenock. In the 19th century, Greenock was a must-play location on the circuit, and every top artist of the day played here. More local women became involved in literature and performing arts in the 20th century, inspired by those who paved the way, and their stories are more readily accessible, so I haven't included them in the book. Nina, or Robertina, was the youngest daughter of sugar merchant William Anderson. She appears to have been the more successful of the sisters artistically, and she is listed in the 1901 census as an art teacher, though I don't know where she taught. She had 4 other sisters, all of whom are mentioned in Robert Bowman's 1871 diary. She died unmarried, aged 61 in 1931. Lizzie Wilmore was an English comedic and burlesque actress who is noted as appearing at the Greenock Theatre Royal in 1861 and 1875. Her father William was an actor. In between time she toured America with her sister Jenny and her first husband W. Ellerton, a comedian. She made her London debut at Drury Lane Theatre in 1863. One review of 1870 in New York states, "Miss Lizzie Wilmore is a clever little soubrette, but her sister Jenny has neither voice, comic humour, nor the slightest quality to recommend her as a burlesque actress." Harsh. Lizzie married again, this time to Courtney Ware. Courtney was a confectioner in Greenock, then a spirit merchant, and then a coal merchant. He was originally from Exeter, but was living at the Glen on Finnart Street. He, like most Greenock merchants, took an interest in ship owning. Born in 1828, he was first married to Agnes Gilchrist, who was running a pub at the Mid-Quay. Somehow he met the young actress Lizzie in Greenock. Subsequently, he gave up his business and seems to have taken up the life of a theatre impresario. Mainly, it would seem, to provide opportunities for Lizzie, whom he married in 1873. He had a lease of the Edinburgh Princess Theatre and the Prince of Wales Theatre in Liverpool. Unfortunately, Lizzie died in 1877, aged 29. The next chapter is about the wives and daughters of the Greenock elite. Virginia Woolf described the angel in the house, an idealised version of womanhood, as immensely sympathetic, immensely charming, utterly unselfish. She excelled in the difficult arts of family life. She sacrificed herself daily. In short, she was so constituted that she never had a mind, but preferred to sympathise always with the minds and wishes of others. Above all, she was pure. Her purity was supposed to be her chief beauty. Mrs. Beeton included the advice that the lady of the house was expected to organise parties that utilised various themes such as nostalgia and alchemy, and dinners to bring prestige to her husband, also making it possible for them to network. Beeton gives extensively detailed instructions on how to supervise servants in preparation for hosting dinners and balls. The etiquette to be observed in sending and receiving formal invitations is given, as well as the etiquette to be observed at the events themselves. The mistress of the house also had an important role in supervising the education of the youngest children. Beeton makes it clear that a woman's place is in the home and her domestic duties come first. Social activities as an individual were less important than household management and socialising as a husband's companion. They were to be strictly limited. After luncheon, morning calls and visits may be made and received. Visits of ceremony or courtesy are uniformly required after dining at a friend's house or after a ball, picnic or any other party. These visits should be short, a stay of 15 to 20 minutes being quite sufficient. A lady paying a visit may remove her boa or neckerchief, but neither shawl nor bonnet. This might conjure up images of Jane Austen novels or Bridgerton, but it was the reality for many women. Absolutely nothing wrong either, as long as there is free choice. In the book, I look at the wives and daughters of some of the well-known in Greenock society. These ladies lived in the West End, living in places like Bel Air, Stoneleigh, Octavia Terrace. The wives of the shipbuilders, sugar refiners and shipowners. Theirs was a life similar to that described above. Church meetings, charitable bazaars, etc. And of course, it's difficult to know what they actually thought, as they didn't write about their lives. We simply have to go with newspaper reports. West End society tended to be pretty closed and cliquey. As we say, most of the West End families were married onto each other. The ladies I look at are Jane Caird, Mary Glenn, Elizabeth Caird, Catherine Adamson, Edith Neal, Grace Shankland, Helen Thorne and Mariquita Caird. Also, Lizzie Forbes. Now, Lizzie Forbes was born in 1852 and lived at 28 Brisbane Street. She was the daughter of Captain John Brochy, who was a chaplain of the Seamen's Friends Society. And in that capacity he wrought assiduously to promote the spiritual and temporal interests of seamen by providing him, through his society, with Bibles and religious tracts, reinforced by earnest sympathetic talks and good advice. The appearance of his lug sail boat Bethel, making for a ship at the tail of the bank, was welcomed by all grades on board, for he was respected not merely as a missionary or preacher, but as a worker, a man whose blunt manner could not conceal the tenderness and intense sympathy which went so far to lighten heavy hearts and open up a fresh vista of life. And while, with a strong sense of duty, he thus devoted himself to the work of his society in its various branches, he lost no opportunity to disseminate the principles of total abstinence, which he had so much at heart. The diaries of Robert Bowman recounts, in the evening, the weather being delicious, strolled out Old Kirk Road and surprised, just coming out from the Larkfield Road, Bob Lyle, Jessie Dalgleish and Lizzie Brochy. On their way home from Gourock, where they had been attending the Episcopal Church to hear that eccentric young preacher, the Reverend G. Phelan, lately imported from Ireland. And such a sermon he gave us, gushed Miss Brochy, in her customary effervescent manner. He chose as his text, and the wagons went down into Egypt, and explained that the wagons meant the ordinances of baptism, marriage, etc. Did you hear such an idea? And what do you think the hymn was that he selected? I promptly hazarded, we'll wait for the wagon, and the merriment put quite an end to explanation of what the hymn actually had been. Lizzie married John Forbes in 1875 and had 9 children. John was a local music seller and later councillor. So both heavily involved in church affairs as well as temperance. Looking at women in education in Inverclyde, we can see the normal patterns of involvement. Private education was the experience of the wealthy. Girls would be educated at home or sent away to boarding schools where the subject of study would be limited, and the teachers would be female schoolmistresses until they got married and were no longer permitted to work. Working class girls would be looked after in charity schools where skills of housekeeping would be taught. There was a market for piano instruction, singing and languages, which was provided by young ladies in the main. The Education Act in 1872 would bring the responsibility of mass education under the control of the local council, and a large percentage of the teachers would be young females. There are, however, very few names of teachers that can be highlighted with life stories. For example, I can't find the name of the first headmistress in the area. In 1871, there were 405 lady teachers in the local Sabbath schools. I would now like to recount a case of bullying, or assault, I should say, in a Port Glasgow school. The article is entitled Big Strong Woman Attacks Lady Teacher in St John's School. It was all about the condition of wee Mick. A well put on, strong, respectable looking woman stood at the bar yesterday on a charge of having assaulted Miss Bennett, the infant schoolmistress of St John's School, Port Glasgow. The accused lady was Catherine McHenry, or McKillop, wife of Patrick McKillop, the lamplighter. According to the evidence led, Miss Bennett had occasion to write to Mrs McKillop that her son Michael, a scholar in St John's School, was not particularly clean. This seems to have incensed Mrs McKillop, for she at once proceeded to the school of St John and demanded to know the reason why her wee son Mick should be called not particularly clean. She asked for Miss Bennett, and on this lady appearing in the corridor, argument did not last long. The lady teacher was seized by her of the head, dragged about the corridor, well shaken and bashed against the partition. In the hands of a woman of such Amazon-like dimensions as Mrs McKillop, it may be easily understood that Miss Bennett was unfit for duty and had to lay up for some days. Bailey Jimison, who heard the case, without further remark, said the sentence would be a fine of £3 or a month in jail. Mrs McKillop went into the adjoining room for a few minutes and then marched back through the court hall. She had paid the money, and the ends of justice being satisfied, she went away at the cost of £3 for endeavouring to avenge the apparent wrong. I'd like to tell you also about Jane Gomishinsky. Her maiden name was Miss Jane Hughes, and she ran a boarding school in Boyd Street in Greenock. She was the daughter of a Liverpool solicitor, Thomas Hughes. She appears to have met a Lieutenant Joseph Gomishinsky of the 1st Polish Lancers, and was married in St John's Episcopal in 1839. Again, I must apologise for making this about her husband. Joseph had arrived in London in July 1836, and he somehow arrived in Greenock and took up teaching French there. He died in 1845 and is buried at the Glasgow necropolis. Apparently exiles from Poland, where he fought for independence in 1830. He is listed as a teacher of French and German and is noted as giving lectures on the history of Poland. His widow was still in the house in 1847, but died in Liverpool in 1877, aged 70. And I presume that she was forced to return home to the support of her family. She continued to teach. Our next topic is religion. Reading about Greenock in the 18th and 19th centuries, it is clear that religious worship and philosophical discussions were the order of the day for a large section of genteel local society, and it's impossible to underestimate the dominance religion had over people's lives. You just have to look at the number of churches that there were in town. Of course, for a long time the Presbyterians of Scotland were seen as God's chosen people, with a God-given work ethic that propelled them around the world seeking their fortunes. It also propelled them to seek to better society at home and abroad, to proselytise for the church, saving the poor, idle and heathen from godlessness. Sabbath schools, church missions, religious societies, temperance societies and even football clubs abounded as a result. The daughters of clergymen, merchants, lawyers, doctors and the like were given educational opportunities which led to a desire to help or contribute to society. Religious education of girls in heathen countries would lead to conversion to Christianity and a better way of life. We have a fantastic example in the life of Margaret and her sisters. Margaret's memoirs of living in Greenock and working in a Bombay mission were published by her husband Reverend John Wilson in the 1840s. We also have Anne Johnson of Willow Park, who published her memoirs of living a religious life and running religious education establishments in Greenock. Inverclyde, like most other Scottish towns, would see an explosion in church building, all coming from disagreements as to the form of religious expression and how the Word of God was presented to the people. Was it as decided by the local laird? Was it through a democratically elected minister? Was it through the individual? Women took a very active role in these discussions. The Rosneath Evangelicals of 1830s and the work of Greenock minister Alexander John Scott created an atmosphere of change which helped pave the way for the disruption of 1843 and was a catalyst for change. Life for many revolved around the church services, Sabbath schools. Bowman, in his diaries of 1871, wrote, "When we reached the school, hard at it, a joyous, happy throng, but we pushed forward and had seats open for us besides Mrs. Jarvie. Mrs. Jarvie, usually so shy and reserved, quite surprised me, so full of fun and as bright and blithe as a gay young damsel. We made a very happy coterie. Can't say I usually affect such church soirees, but this evening convinces me I have been more self-denying than I imagined. The good fellowship, kindly feeling and exquisite courtesy from all to all were delightful, and for the future I will not willingly be absent." On March the 27th, 1871, he tells the story of being in the evening at Mr. and Mrs. Jarvie's young folks party. They had the Congregational Church at George Square. Girls from about 18 to 25 and young fellows from about 20 to 20, and of course all members of George Square Chapel. The evening started almost lugubriously. Parlour games such as Juvenile's Effect soon bored, so when Joanna Cunningham whispered, "It would be ever so much nicer if we could dance," and others looked aghast with holy horror, I volunteered to Mr. Jarvie on the subject and make the suggestion to him. He listened gravely, then, more in sorrow than in anger, said that he personally disliked dancing, and except in the case of the little children, he discouraged it. So I had to beat an ignominious retreat, and with the best grace I could, re-engage in the exhilarating juvenilities. It was in this atmosphere of the church halls and church meetings and Sunday schools that quite a few Greenock ladies went to the missions. One whom I talk about in the book is Jeannie Lawson, who was married to Dougal Lawson, connected with Orangefield Baptist Church in Greenock, who were missionaries to Yangcheng in northern China. Dougal was from the family that Greenockians will know from the manufacture of apothecary drinks, the Greenock Apothecaries or Lawson's Lemonade. Jeannie has become more well known through the years as the woman who brought Gladys Aylward to China. She in turn was the subject of the Hollywood film The Inn of the Sixth Happiness, starring Ingrid Bergman. The Lawsons left for the China Inland Mission in 1886. They stayed initially till 1916, during which time they endured the loss of 5 children and the start of the Boxer Rebellion, forcing them to move to the safety of Shanghai. They returned to their mission, but by the end of the First World War, they had returned to Scotland to publicise their work. Going back to scenes of destruction and massacres at the mission stations, they suffered through famine and natural disasters, and they soon returned to Scotland, again where Dougal died in 1930. Jeannie, amazingly, returned to China in her 70s with Gladys Aylward, the work of her mission, by turning their home into an inn for travellers. Gladys's first Chinese was a chant, "We have no bugs, we have no fleas, good, 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 come, come, come." Her job was to grab the leading mule of a caravan and lead him into the courtyard. After the mules were fed, their drivers became willing listeners to simple Bible stories. Jeannie suffered a fall and would die as a result, buried beside her 5 children. Before that moment, she is reported to have said, "God called you to my side, Gladys. He wants you to carry on his work here. He will provide, he will bless and protect you." In this chapter, I look at a few of the benefactors that have been in the area. We look at 5 ladies who made their mark by philanthropy. The source of wealth was their male relations. This they put to good use in a variety of places and to a variety of purposes, but mostly in the tradition of Victorian society in religious education and healthcare. The beneficiaries of Gabriel Wood, his sister Frances and his wife Louisa, endowed Greenock with one of its grandest buildings, the Mariners' Asylum. This building currently is, however, under a cloud of uncertainty as to its future. Mrs. Caroline Gamble married into wealth and distributed a lot of it in memory of her 2 husbands. She owned Ashburn House in Gourock, another building under significant threat. The Gamble Halls, which she funded, is still a community asset. Maggie Rankin is remembered by thousands who can call themselves Rankin babies, born at the Rankin Memorial Hospital. She did so much more in commemorating the lives of her brothers, who represent the traditional heavy industries of the town. But let me talk about Caroline Ann Gamble. We know her from the building in Gourock, constructed in the memory of her husband Henry Gamble, but who was Mrs. Gamble? Caroline Ann Oswald was born in Belgium in 1818 and was part of the Oswald family of Dunakeer or Dunakeer, Kirkcaldy, and was connected to high society. Her aunt, for example, married Lord Elgin after his controversial divorce of Mary Nisbet. Her cousin, Lady Augusta Bruce, was a resident bedchamber woman to Queen Victoria, and her uncle was General Sir John Oswald. Caroline married Arthur Saltmarsh of Corby Cour in Yorkshire in 1838. She was 20 at the time, and he was 37 years older than her. He was from a very old and established family and was a merchant selling firearms to Bombay and wool and cotton to North and South America, in partnership with a William Rawson. Rawson married into the Saltmarsh family in the 18th century, and the family were bankers in Halifax, Yorkshire. Caroline and Arthur had no family. Saltmarsh died in 1864 and left his estate to his wife, and she donated £3,000 to Ridley Hall in Cambridge, a theological college. She then married Henry Gamble, a Presbyterian minister in Ballywater, Ireland, in 1866. He seems to have immediately retired, and they moved to Ashburn House in Gourock. Unfortunately, he died in 1870 on board the ship Nyanza off Marseille, and her life from that time on was one of devotion to religious causes and sailing on her steam yachts. She remained in Gourock until 1879 when she left for Torquay. She died in 1894. What is absolutely clear is her religious fervour and her willingness to contribute to society. She was certainly in a very privileged position, but it's interesting to see her in the context as more than just the name of a community hall in Gourock. Now, it might seem a bit strange to put the topics of war and health together, but the timing of events meant that the First World War coincided with a greater role being available and required for women. The fact was that the sheer scale of the conflict opened up opportunities for the recruitment of women to roles traditionally occupied by men. There was also quite a crossover with campaigns for political change. The women, for example, who became doctors at the end of the 19th century tended to be from those families who were actively involved in the suffrage movement. Elsie Inglis offered to set up war hospitals staffed by women, but this was refused by the government. She went ahead regardless, and quite a few local women volunteered with the Scottish Women's Hospital. Elizabeth Taylor Gilchrist was born in Greenock on the 23rd of October 1863 to William and Elizabeth Gilchrist. She was the third child of the couple. William had a draper's business in the town. It was a well-known business and survived until relatively recently. Elizabeth was a scholar and won a place at Edinburgh University to study medicine with Jex Blake, who was one of the original 7 Edinburgh ladies or Edinburgh doctors. Elizabeth won a medal for practical chemistry, being the most successful student at the Edinburgh School of Medicine for Women in 1891. She qualified as a doctor in 1894, and after working in a children's hospital in Edinburgh, she practiced as a GP in Greenock, the first woman doctor. During the war, she was stationed at Malta, where she would have been responsible for the care of many local men who'd been injured at Gallipoli. She then went on to Salonika. On her journey to Salonika, 2 of the escort ships were sunk by submarines. Elizabeth sadly died in October 1919 as a consequence of her war work. A Greenock woman, Jessie Laurie, was responsible for the financial administration and fundraising for the Scottish Women's Hospital in the First World War, set up by our friend Elsie Inglis and fellow suffragists. All this took place at our home, the Red House on Argown Street. This is a picture of Jessie with Sarah Mayer, the president of the Scottish Women's Suffrage Society, sitting on the stairs to our house. The picture on the left was taken earlier this year. This particular now and then image is a strong one. You can just imagine the busy atmosphere in that house of women suffragists debating the issues of the day and raising funds for such an important cause, a cause which showed their willingness to help in time of need. Jessie Laurie and other local women were part of a political awakening in the second half of the 19th century. These women were campaigning for better educational opportunities and a greater recognition of their needs and desires. The Liberal Women's Association was set up to advance women's participation in politics, especially with a view to gaining voting rights, and suffrage societies took the campaign to the streets. The First World War was a major factor in increasing the role of women in all areas of life, eventually gaining an increase in women's voting rights. Local women also felt able to participate in local government from that time. In this chapter, I highlight some of the women who made a name in the field of politics, or political and social change. This, of course, has been an ongoing process for women right through to the Me Too movement. The fight against accepted norms, caricatures, behaviours and interests is an eternal fight. Jessie Laurie was a suffragist who believed in non-violent protest and campaigning. Others, such as the Pankhursts, were suffragettes who believed that direct action was the only way forward. Adela Pankhurst visited Greenock alongside Flora Drummond, who had been arrested 12 times and jailed with the Pankhursts. Flora would carry out hunger strikes while imprisoned, with the result that her health suffered. She died in 1949, aged 70. However, she had come to live in Rothesay, and she named her son after the Labour leader Keir Hardie. Her son lived and died in Greenock. Anne Kenny supported Christabel Pankhurst's policy of militant action and served several terms in prison, went on hunger strike and thirst strike, and endured forcible feeding. After the imprisonment of Emmeline Pankhurst and other leaders in 1912 and Christabel's escape to France, Anne took over the London end of the organisation. Annie withdrew almost entirely from active politics at one point, physically and mentally exhausted. She came to Greenock to recuperate, which might suggest that she had friends here, or at least a supportive community. She met James Taylor, who was working at the torpedo factory in Greenock, and they married in April 1920. We often see names of women in the local newspapers in connection with running small businesses such as inns, hotels, lodging houses, spirit dealers and shops, especially grocers, seamstresses and dressmakers. In 1857 there were 37 listings of dressmakers. Many of these women were widows or young women or the wives of men at sea. There aren't too many details for these women, but I would like to highlight a few of them and the life opportunities that came their way. It was not until later in the 19th century, through access to university education, that we see mention of women in industry and other forms of work that were previously restricted to men, such as the medical professions. In the chapter in the book, I also mentioned Agnes Borthwick from Greenock, who ran the Georgetown Munition Works at Bishopton during the First World War. Margaret Buchanan was a hotel keeper in Greenock who had run the Temperance Hotel and then the White Hart Inn prior to moving to the old Tontine on Cathcart Street. She was the sister of Dr. Wallace. The government wanted to build a new general post office and the site of the Tontine was chosen. Margaret and her daughter moved to the current location in Argown Square. And so, to wrap up, the towns of Inverclyde seem to be connected in one way or another to almost every area of life in the west of Scotland and beyond. I often say how important the towns and villages of Inverclyde are, and how much the people in these areas contributed, not only in a local way, but to Scotland as a whole, and indeed internationally. Hopefully this book has shown that it's not just the men who have made such valuable contributions, but the women too. While researching these women, there have been an abundance of evidence showing intellect, dedication, honourable intent, charitable work, kindness, artistic flair, talent, political and social awareness, and everything in between. There are also harsh realities of the daily lives of working class women, which are not represented as fully as I would like within these pages. Many of the women included in this book are from the middle and upper classes, as there are records of them, although often from the male lens as supporting actors to their husbands and fathers. Money and status could afford some of these women better opportunities and privileges, but they were still women and in the main treated as subordinate to men. Examples exist of those who fought against this, to be recognised in their own right, but it was not easy. The women of Inverclyde have been a joy to discover, and it is a privilege to share their stories here. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please do get in touch. Otherwise, farewell.